Hey, I'm Sam Pressler.
And I'm PJ Walsh, and this is In Stitches, the podcast that explores the humanity and humor.
Today we have Shon Hopwood on, and his story and his life experience is unlike any I've ever heard. From a star basketball player to a bank robber to 10 years in federal prison to now a leading criminal justice reform advocate, Georgetown Law professor, and Supreme Court lawyer. It's
mind-blowing. And there's so much humanity that he shares. And then there's also humor. And he's super famous. We're very happy to have him. I mean, 60 Minutes did a whole entire thing on him. But the beauty of it is he's actually with us for a full 60 minutes. We get the whole arc, the whole story, not chopped up. It's a great episode.
Well, without further ado, let's get Shon Hopwood on In Stitches. All right, Shon Hopwood, welcome to In Stitches.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I don't know about you and your excitement for this episode, but PJ and I, in preparing, we were just like, where do we even begin? And I don't.
You must be talking about my traditional background as a lawyer and a law professor.
Yeah, it's like, how did you crush the LSATs that way? It's just
has nothing to do with the 5-armed bank robberies.
Had nothing to do with that. Well, I want to get into that, but I think before we get there, I'd be really interested in just like hearing a little bit about your upbringing. Like, where did you start out?
I grew up in rural Nebraska, a sprawling metropolis of about 2,500 people where everyone knew everyone. And, my dad helped manage a feed yard. My mom, at least while I was in high school, was a stay-at-home mom with 4 other children. And, I kind of grew up around barbecues and baseball games.
When you were growing up, like, what was your family environment like? What was it that you did as a kid? Like, what was your kind of background there?
I played lots of basketball, played lots of football. And, through high school, there wasn't much else to do in my hometown other than, sneak out of town and go have a few cold beers.
Husker fan, clearly?
Oh, of course. You can't live in Nebraska without that.
I spent a lot of time. We
don't have professional sports teams, so the Huskers are the whole ball game in town.
I used to tour Larry Cable Guy and pretty much lived with him for years in Walton, Nebraska. Have been in his box at the Husker games while he's throwing out hot dogs to everybody. Sam, if you've never been to a Husker, it is insanity. It is, because Nebraska is like flat, nothing going on, and you pull up, huge flag, that big end. It's awesome.
Yeah, on game days, Saturday in the fall, the stadium is the 3rd largest city in Nebraska.
And so where did you end up going to school? Did you go to University of Nebraska? Where did you land?
No. I've never attended school at the University of Nebraska. Surprisingly, this past spring, they invited me to be the commencement speaker of the University of Nebraska law school class that's graduating. But I didn't get to do that, of course, because of the pandemic. I went to a small Lutheran school on a basketball scholarship. I didn't last very long, about 2 weeks into the second semester, and they kicked me out. Something to do with, them wanting me to go to class and actually do schoolwork. I didn't think that was a great idea at the time. And then I made my way to the U.S. Navy for 2 years.
Okay, so and then PJ's a Navy guy. So you left college. Like, what was that decision to join the Navy? Why did you decide to join?
Because I didn't have much else to do. There weren't a lot of other options for me at the time. And, it seemed like a good idea to go into the service and maybe get some discipline.
That's aligns with exactly why I joined. Really, that's a lot of us. A lot of us look around and be like, man, I need to get it together.
Yeah, well, not even the U.S. military could turn me into a rule follower, unfortunately.
That's what I find interesting. Like, when I was reading your backstory is you grew up in a Christian household, Midwest, joined the Navy. Clearly, right from wrong, in that. And then also you put your hand up, made a vow to, put your life to defend others. And then you come home. And then how did that not translate to that worst moment that, like, and I've heard you talk saying, like, we're all judged by our worst moment. How did all those previous experiences make you have that night in the bar go, yeah, right?
Well, I think a lot of it was what happens with a lot of young men 18 to 25. We know that most crime in America is committed by men 18 to 25. And when you look at the social science, it's not a surprise. Young men have a hard time with impulse control. They have a hard time with doing things to earn something long down the road, such as a 4-year college degree. And we know that young men, again, are often very reckless. And I was all three of those things. Plus, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And, I had made a whole host of horrible decisions that negatively impacted my own life, and I didn't care. So once you get to the point where you don't care about the consequences of your actions on yourself, it's pretty easy to not care about the consequences of your actions on someone else. And so, I think that's why when my friend invites me to the bar and says, what do you think about robbing a bank? There were lots of responses to that question. Outside of, yes, that sounds like a great idea.
So, because I'm sure in your life, you've had plenty of people come up to you later and said, man, had they known what I did back in so-and-so, I'm sure like people getting you around that. But to go and execute it, to plan it, can you like walk us through that? Because it's one day to wake up the next day, you're hungover, and you're like, okay, you know what? We're doing this.
Well, that's exactly what happened. Nobody, when we discussed it that day, neither one of us thought, oh, we're going to actually do this. And in fact, it took us about 6 months of goading each other on about, are we really going to do this or not, before we finally got up the nerve to do it.
Wow.
So, you to do that sort of level of foolishness, you almost have to shut your rational brain off. Mm-hmm. And, it would be hard for me to do that now, but 21 years old, it wasn't actually that hard.
When you walk into that bank following through for the first time, like, what's going through your head? Like, what are you feeling?
Everything in your body is telling you to not do this, to get out and to run. Again, knew right from wrong, knew that this was something bad, was feeling all of those emotions in the middle of the robbery. Not to mention, you're just trying to focus on getting in and out of the robbery just as quickly as you can. And, it's not easy to focus on the things you should be focused on. I'll give you an example. In the middle of the bank robbery, my co-defendant yells, "Hopwood, go check the front window." Not the best of moves to say your real name in the middle of a bank robbery. And when we walked out of that first robbery, the goal was I was carrying the money bags. He was supposed to walk out to the car, open the door for me, and let me in the passenger seat, and he's supposed to get in the driver's seat and take off. Well, when we get out of the bank, he walks out, opens the door to the passenger seat, and gets in and sits down.
Oh, my God.
And I'm standing outside the window holding the money bag like he just, completely forgot the whole plan, because that's what stress and this feeling does to a person.
Oh, that's incredible. And I think the most incredible thing about that is you did that the first time and you still managed to do it 4 more times. Some people are dumber than others, and I didn't have a limit on how dumb of things I could do back then.
The other 4 times they were wearing their football jerseys with their names on their back, Sam.
Yeah. It's really hard for me to think about doing that dumb stuff.
Right,
Now as a dad and a father and a lawyer and somebody who, I could be down at the White House next week or up in the US Senate talking with members of Congress next week, and my life's so different. And of course, I would never do any of that again. But back then, I was just a different person.
And that's your transition is really, this is only the part that set you off, but it's everything that comes after, which is just incredibly fascinating. What Sam and I have been talking about, it really is at that. But the one thing I need to know, just in this moment, you're incredibly monotone. You're very controlled when you speak. Is that how you were when you robbed? Because it would be like a sloth robbing a bank to me. Like, were you that calm and controlled? Like,
no.
Right.
No, but part of that was intentional. You have to scream and act like you're a maniac because then people will listen to you. And the goal of doing a bank robbery is to get people to listen and just do what you want so you can get in and out without any problem. We never intended to hurt anyone. Mm-hmm. There was a woman that walked in one of the bank robberies, and I didn't even see her walk in the front door, but I heard the other people say, just get down on the ground and do what he tells you. And I turn around and I look at this woman. She must have been in her 60s. She looks at me and she's like, and runs right back out the front door. I'm not listening to whoever this guy is in a mask with a gun. And she took off, and, I, of course, just let her. Because we didn't plan to hurt anybody, but in order for that to go off without a hitch, you kind of have to scare everyone into compliance.
It's really fascinating. So eventually you ended up getting caught. What happened? Kind of walk us through getting caught, the sentencing process. How did that go down?
Yeah, so I was staying at a hotel in Omaha, Nebraska with some other people, and I had left the hotel for a few hours and came back and was looking for my brother, couldn't find him. Walked in and out of the hotel a couple times, didn't realize that there were 4 or 5 gentlemen in suits sitting in the lobby. Didn't think anything of it until the last time I tried to walk back out when they said FBI and they tackled me. They then impounded my car, and, they had taken my car to the FBI station. When I get to the FBI station, they had already removed everything out of the trunk. And let's just say it was not a good day because there was $140,000 directly traceable to the last bank I had robbed, multiple guns, scanners, face masks, like every tool of the trade, and everything that could make me look incredibly guilty because I was sprawled out on the ground near my car. And needless to say, I didn't have much of a defense.
Man.
Wow.
Well, I'm also interested a little bit, just to go back, is after the first one, you start to feel real guilty. That's you started to spiral, right? That's when drugs came in.
Yes. Started drinking a lot, started smoking marijuana to try and forget about what we had done, and just, became very antisocial and just, would sit in my apartment a lot wondering when the FBI was going to show up, because I was pretty convinced we were going to get caught. When people hear that, they're like, well, then why didn't you stop? Right. Because in my mind, when the FBI caught me, they were just going to shoot me and it was going to be over. And so, my rational thought and frame of reference was so impaired by that point between depression, alcohol, drugs, and feeling remorseful for the bad things we had done that I was clearly not thinking clearly.
Yeah. And it strikes me that there was, and this seems like it's a theme throughout your journey, but there was like potentially a purpose that you had growing up, which was maybe tied to basketball. Like, I mean, I grew up as a basketball player playing college basketball. Like, I know what it is to do the pistol Pete drills, dribbling up and down until you can't feel your hands anymore. And then you lose that sense of purpose and you're like, who am I now? Like, what is my purpose now? And there's this kind of, when you don't find that, there's a little bit of that like nihilism that may come from it.
That's exactly what happened. I think part of it that led me down that road was I went to college and realized, oh man, there are people that are a lot better at basketball than I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that had never happened. And, basketball was such a big part of my life that, when that was taken away, I was kind of rudderless there for a few years, even while in the Navy. I just didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And so, it was easy to go off on some foolish mission that I thought would be exciting.
Do you ever get tired of talking about your bank robbery story? Like, you have family and kids, you're a renowned professor and criminal justice advocate. Like, do you get tired of going through this every day?
Well, I did for a while.
You answered it with a breath. You know that. All right.
I did for a while. In part because I wanted people to think I was a good lawyer on its own terms and not just a good story. But I've kind of come to terms with the fact that I am the freak show of the legal academy, and that as long as I'm a law professor, no matter what I do in the profession, people are first and foremost going to remember how I went to prison for robbing banks and how I learned the law in prison, and that's where my legal career started. And at this point, no, I'm not, in part because it helps me so much in my work for criminal justice reform. Most of the time I give the same introduction. I've given this introduction to Rotary clubs, in churches, in the U.S. Senate. I gave this introduction before President Trump. And here's how it goes, which is, my name's Shon Hopwood. I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. And I committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal. And the reason I start with that is because people think that, character's static, and once you've committed a crime, you're bad forever. And that's just simply not the case. All the social science tells us that people age out of crime. They quit doing the dumb things that they did before. You don't see people in their 50s and 60s out pistol whipping people. And I try and use that to get that across to people, and I use it in my work all the time. So I've kind of come to terms with the fact that I will never fully escape my past, and that's okay.
That acceptance it's such a clear part of the impact that you make today. Now, jumping ahead, you end up getting sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. I'm particularly interested in hearing about your time in prison because it's, I think prison in American society is something that is one of the most misunderstood institutions that there is. And you've lived that experience and are able to speak to it in a way that, frankly, few people have the opportunity and platform to do. When you were there, what did you find to be the most challenging element of being in prison?
Well, I'd say it challenged all of my preconceived notions about prison and who's in prison. I grew up in a poor to middle class white family in rural Nebraska. And, my family, myself included, we thought, well, prison's where the worst of the worst go. That's where we send the evil people. And then when I got to prison, what I found was not evil people. It was just people that for whatever reason made bad mistakes. Some of them didn't have a lot of opportunities to begin with. But what I saw was mostly people that if they had a little bit of encouragement and that if they were given a few resources, they could be very successful and law-abiding citizens. It's just they, for whatever reason, had never been given that chance, especially the people that I saw who suffered from mental health issues that had gone untreated. And then, of course, when they get to prison, let's just say the prison system's not the place for personal growth. They don't have the best doctors, the best psychiatrists, and so they actually end up coming out of prison worse off, not better. But I think originally it challenged my notion that prison is where the worst of the worst go. Because, there were people that are very dangerous in prison and that I don't think have any moral qualms with hurting another individual and wouldn't feel remorseful about it. But that was such a small segment of the people that I saw in federal prison.
And so maybe to drill in on that, where were the moments where you found humanity, maybe unexpected humanity when you were in prison?
I think I found it in all sorts of ways. I found it through sports. One of the things I did when I first got to the federal prison was I decided to play basketball, even though all of the white guys told me not to. At that point, there were no white guys playing basketball. And I decided to do it anyway. And I ended up getting a lot of respect and had a lot of joy playing basketball with the other guys. I also found it in the law library where people were studying and working on their cases and willing to help one another, even when there wasn't anything in it for them. And that's where I saw the humanity. And what I also saw was a bunch of people. Imagine if your children acted up. The last thing you would want to do is then take those children away from everyone they love and isolate them in a very small room with a bunch of other children who are acting up. That doesn't go well. It's the same way with adults. What I saw were a lot of fathers who were devastated by the fact that they may not see their kids again for 10 or 20 years. Some of those people, were in the throes of serious drug addiction when they were out committing their crimes. And then they'd end up in prison, they'd get clean, the person would come back and they'd realize, oh my gosh, what have I done? I'm not going to see my family again for another 10 years. And when they hit that realization, it was devastating to them.
I've heard you say this too in one of your interviews too, which I found pretty fascinating, that you saw more drugs in prison than you'd seen out. Like that whole war on drugs thing is, not really taking.
Well, so this was a medium-high federal prison with 2 layers of fences with razor wires. And then outside the razor wires are a bunch of stones, round stones shaped like this, so that if you jump off the fence, you're going to break your ankle. And surrounded outside of that are pickup trucks with armed guards consistently driving around the prison. And if we can't keep drugs out of that prison, how in the heck are we going to keep it out of the country? And so, I study the war on drugs a lot. And what I tell you is we've spent billions of dollars. We've locked up millions of people. And you look at drug usage rates across the country, and they're about the same as they were 20 years ago. The only thing that changes is the drug. In the late 80s, early 90s, it was crack cocaine and cocaine. Then it moved to methamphetamine, and now we're in the fentanyl and opiates. But outside of the drugs changing, not much else has changed.
There's a comic irony in this idea of like you're in prison for drug use, and meanwhile there's more drugs in prison than out of prison.
I mean, all of it was funny. In hindsight, it didn't feel that way always in the moment, but all sorts of stories. The FBI came in one day and raided the prison and took out a bunch of the prisoners for selling drugs. And then the FBI came back in the prison, and we thought they were coming back for more prisoners. And what they did was started handcuffing staff and taking them out because they knew the staff was bringing it in.
Oh my God.
We had 2 gentlemen who did not like prison and decided to escape one day. And that was a funny story because what they did was the fences have sensors that if you start climbing the walls of the fence, it's going to alert. So what these 2 Hispanic guys did was they would go out to the fence and they'd throw rocks at it. And then when the main control panel would radio the pickup to come around to make sure no one was escaping, they'd go run and hide. And they kept doing that until the front office shut the sensor off. And then they escaped. And they never found those 2 guys. Wow. And the officer that shut off the sensor was one of the biggest dicks in the prison. And he gets laid off for a year, but ultimately they give him back pay for a year and he keeps his job. Like, I would think your primary job first as a prison guard is to make sure people don't escape. And he couldn't even do that, and he still didn't lose his job.
You're the censor guy. That's your whole thing.
That's right. That's right. And I hated that guy because he once kicked out my wife who came to visit me because she put my knee on her hand on my knee. She had driven 8 hours and he kicked her out. But really what it was she is a very beautiful woman. And this guy, lives in a trailer park and can't get a date and was very angry that somebody else was having a beautiful woman come visit them. She wasn't my wife at the time. He was just an absolute hater and used to walk into the unit and just torment people for shits and giggles.
Oh my God.
One of the things that you said that really, really stuck with me is like, you go in day one and then the day you leave, even if it's 12 years, you get treated the same all the way through. Like, I've never heard that before. It really hit hard. You very eloquently have explained how you see 5 years as being all people need. And then after that, it just becomes kind of like a holding pattern.
Yeah, I mean, it's just warehousing. If someone doesn't get the message after being in prison, in American prison for 5 years, it's hard to believe that they're going to get the message after 10 or 15. And after a while, it's diminishing returns, because the great irony of the American criminal justice system is the longer someone spends in corrections, most of the time, the least likely they are to come out and be corrected. And it's not just necessarily about them as individuals. You take anyone and you put them in an environment where their job skills deteriorate, their social skills deteriorate. All they're used to doing is talking and being around dudes for 10 years. I mean, one of the things I had to deal with when I first got out of prison was I worked at this office in Omaha, Nebraska. 80% of the employees were women. Mm-hmm. And they called me the bull in the china shop because I still talk like a prisoner, and I talk like, I had been around nothing but dudes for 11 years. Mm-hmm. Wow. And, it's just really hard to come back into society and get on your feet when you have been conditioned to be a certain way. I'll give you an example. In prison, when you get into an argument or some sort of fight, there's no de-escalation. Someone gets up in your face and yells, you yell louder. They take a swing, you take 2 swings. If you don't, you will be viewed as soft, and people will rob, rape, and steal from you. Mm-hmm. Now, imagine how someone who's been conditioned to that lifestyle for 11 years and then gets out and within 3 weeks proposes to his girlfriend and gets married, and an argument starts in the marriage. Imagine how that works out. Mm-hmm. My poor wife to this day has to deal with, trauma and stuff that I'm still reliving from 11 years of federal prison. It's not very easy for me to say I'm sorry and de-escalate in the middle of an argument, because for so long, that wasn't even an option.
Mm-hmm. It's both an internal and an external, right? Because internally, you've now basically gone into an environment that is designed to make you as unprepared as possible to re-enter civilian life, right? To re-enter day-to-day life. And then externally, you're going into a system of stigmatizing, shaming, where that everything is stacked against you. So even if you had the perfect re-entry experience, you now have to check felon on the box. Every hurdle is made harder for you. And we wonder why we have such high recidivism rates.
Yeah, we don't prepare people for release in prison. We're doing better at it than when I was in, but in 11 years in the federal prison system, I never heard one staff member say the word rehabilitation. No one even pretended like that was a goal. The goal was simply punishment. And then, when we put somebody in the sort of Lord of the Flies situation for a decade, we give them nothing in the way of reentry resources. And then we kick them to the outside world and say, don't mess up again. And then when they do, we say, well, see, you were always evil to begin with. But that's not necessarily saying something about them as individuals. It's saying something about the system and how we tend to send people to prison and let them come out worse off, not better.
I am interested in continuing with your story. So we've talked about this moment, when you've decided to rob banks, which is kind of the low point and kind of your lack of purpose, lack of meaning in your life. Can you tell us about that turning point that you had in prison where you, like that purpose, like that that spark of a purpose started to re-enter your life again?
Yeah, so I had gotten a job working in the law library. I knew nothing about the law, had no idea I would be interested in it. And in fact, the first 6 months I was in the law library, all I did was hand out books. I didn't look at those books. They were big, they were thick, they were intimidating. It felt like these opinions from judges were written in another language. And I had no motivation to learn it up until the Supreme Court decided a case that I, along with everyone in federal prison, thought could lead to a sentence release, an early release. And let me tell you, there is no greater incentive to someone in prison than the thought of getting out of prison early. It's one of the reasons why I often advocate that states and the federal government should tie rehabilitation courses to the incentive of early release, because if you incentivize the men to do the right things in prison, they will do it. A lot of them will do it. There were no incentives, but there was an incentive for me to start learning the law. And I did. And I spent 2 weeks working on my own case. I prepared a brief that I pecked out on a prison typewriter, and then I filed it in court. And then 3 weeks later, I get a letter from the court saying, Mr. Hopwood, it would really behoove you to file your brief in the correct court. So that was the start of my legal career, filing a brief in the wrong court that I had pecked out on a prison typewriter. It's not something I tell my students. It's not a story I tell my students a lot. But what I found was I kind of enjoyed this process of solving this legal puzzle and writing out the solution. So I started helping other people who didn't have enough money to afford a lawyer. And either the second or the third legal brief I prepared was for a friend of mine named John Fellers that was filed in the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, when we filed that brief, no one, including me, thought that it had any chance. I thought we were right on the arguments, but that doesn't matter in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court gets around 7,000 to 8,000 petitions a year. They grant 70 to 80 of those, which means you have a 1% chance of getting your case heard. 1% chances for lawyers filing briefs to them, not indigent federal prisoners, where on the front of the brief where the lawyer's name should be, it just says John Fellers, meaning he's representing himself. The chance of getting a case heard like that is about 1% of 1%. So we filed John's brief. John transferred to another prison. I forgot about his case. One morning I was headed to the recreation yard and a friend of mine came running and screaming out of the housing unit. I say this a lot, but the first thing I thought in my head was, what did I say to Wade yesterday that makes him want to come fight me at 6:30 in the morning? You see people running and screaming at each other in federal prison? Not a good sign. But what he had was a copy of the USA Today saying that the Supreme Court of the United States had granted John Fellers' case. And it said how unlikely that was, given that John had filed on his own. And it even quoted a couple sentences from that brief that I had pecked out on that prison typewriter.
Wow.
And while I knew it was a big deal, you would have never convinced me at that moment that this would lead me to doing more work in the law, going to law school, becoming a lawyer and a law professor. But I knew it was important for a different reason, which was after that case was granted, I became very, very popular in federal prison.
Oh, I bet, right?
There were not many days I could walk across the compound without somebody saying, hey, Shon, can I talk to you for 5 minutes? Just let me tell you about my case. And I was instantly very, very popular in federal prison.
And did that make your life easier or harder?
Both. But it felt good to do something that, my parents were proud of. It felt good to do something that helped some other person where there wasn't any benefit to me, but I was actually being able to use skills that I was acquiring in prison to help others. And that changed my life. I would just wish I wouldn't have needed to go to federal prison to learn that I had an aptitude and a love for the law.
Right. Well, and people won't be able to see this because we see each other on Zoom. But when you were describing it, you use your hands almost like a Rubik's Cube. And I say this, Sam and I had this conversation last night as I'm a comedian. And when I discovered comedy, I realized that's when my brain clicked in, like how to move a punchline and how to do this and that. And as you were describing that, I physically could see like, oh, this is where your brain clicked in. when you found that purpose, and then and you saw it helping other people, that had to be kind of like the Phoenix Rising moment.
It was, and it was basically what set me on a path to rehabilitation. And surprisingly, it had nothing to do with anything the system had done. Like I was rehabilitating and finding a purpose despite the system, not because of the system.
Wow. Well, when you think of what had to go right, there were so many inflection points at which things went right to kind of put you on your trajectory. So first, you do this case, it gets heard by the Supreme Court. We didn't close the story. So walk us through. So the case is now up to be heard by the Supreme Court. You develop a pretty amazing relationship as you're going to get this case heard. Can you kind of pick us up from there?
Yeah, well, the first thing I realized was the Supreme Court was not going to send the Con Air flight to come pick me up and let me argue the case in orange jumpsuit before the Supreme Court of the United States in handcuffs and shackles. So we realized John Fellers needed a lawyer. And then, the day after the case is granted, John Fellers becomes the most popular person in federal prison because all the lawyers in D.C. are calling him saying, I will take your case for free, because they all want to argue the case because it's the pinnacle of any lawyer's career. But John realized, maybe I don't want the people that are calling, maybe I want the people that aren't calling, and had reached out to a lawyer named Seth Waxman, who was the former Solicitor General of the United States during the Clinton administration. The Solicitor General is who represents the United States in every case before the Supreme Court. And he, by this point, had been in private practice. And, for a lawyer to argue one case in the Supreme Court, less than 1% of lawyers get to do that. For a lawyer to argue 5 cases in the Supreme Court, they're considered a Supreme Court expert. And they're just, there are only a couple handfuls of people that have argued that many cases. Seth Waxman's argued over 80 cases in the Supreme Court of the United States.
Wow.
Representing all sorts of like little tiny companies like Apple and Twitter and Monsanto. And, he's the creme de la creme of appellate lawyers. And so he decides to take John Fellers' case. But what he tells John is something really strange. He says, John, you did a really good job on this cert petition. And John said, well, I didn't write it. A friend of mine wrote it. And he said, well, is your friend a former lawyer who then got in trouble and ended up in prison? He's like, no. He's like, he just started self-learning the law, a year and a half ago. And Seth said, do you think we can keep him involved in the case? And, I tell people this all the time. Like, wow. Seth Waxman did not need my help. This guy, Harvard undergrad, Yale Law School, clerk for federal judges, has, some of the top lawyers in the country that work for him. He did not need me, but for whatever reason, he found value in keeping me a part of the team. I later found out that his big firm, Wilmer Hale, had a nickname for me. I was in-house counsel, as in the big house. But it was quite remarkable, he's sending in drafts of merits briefs to me in federal prison. I'm marking them up with notes and sending them back out. At one point, my prison counselor, sets up a call for me to talk with Seth and 3 other lawyers the week before oral arguments. And, this was just so bizarre and unusual, but, what an amazing opportunity for me to learn from some of the best lawyers in the country while I'm still in federal prison.
Were you aware at the time while it was going on, like, this is amazing? Or was it a little bit of ignorance is bliss kind of deal,
I knew Seth's caliber and what this meant. I didn't realize that long after the case was over, that he and the other lawyer, Noah Levine, would continue to be a friend and mentor me. And needless to say, Seth and Noah wrote letters of support for me to get into law school. They wrote letters of support for me to get a law license. They wrote letters of support for me to get a federal clerkship with a federal judge, and that they would be lifelong mentors and friends.
Well, and this is where your story, it just feels like things start to click into place, right? Like going back, you've talked about how like you just wish you had someone in your ear before you were going to commit the bank robbery, just say, hey, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? And like, there wasn't that person there. Now you're in prison and you have some of the most influential people in the world of law who have your back, who see something in you. What was that like for you? Just that contrast.
When you're in an environment where every day the implicit and explicit message is you're a piece of garbage, you did wrong, you're always going to be a piece of garbage. In fact, when you get out, it's only a matter of time before you commit a new offense and come back. To then have someone like Seth Waxman say, you know what, you did a really great job on this cert petition. I want to make you a part of this team in the Supreme Court. Or, you know, my current wife who was writing me letters and saying, you know, you can do these things that you don't think you can do. You can go to school. That made a huge impact on what, you know, on my dreams, on what I thought I was capable of. Most people in prison don't have that encouragement. They're just told that you'll never be able to change and you're always just going to be a criminal.
Well, I just found it fascinating that you found it outside of prison. And here's the structure that if they could just implement ways to give people confidence and hope and restructure the mind frame, but it would just be a better country. It would save money. And
lead to a lot less crime.
Yeah, a lot less crime. And the idea that you had to go out, clearly outside the gates to get that kind of encouragement is disheartening to hear, because as people, we want to give everybody a second chance and rehabilitate people. Everyone deserves that.
Yeah. It's almost as if you were to design a criminal justice system to lead to all of the worst outcomes, that's the system we have. And I fully don't understand it when, you know, we claim to be the land of liberty on the one hand, and on the other, the United States incarcerates people at a greater rate than any other country on the planet. Those two things just don't match up well with each other. You can't say that we want to protect people's liberty and then lock up 2.2 million people for as long as we lock people up.
Yeah. So you end up winning that Supreme Court case 9-0. You end up getting another case heard by the Supreme Court, right? You have 1% of 1% times 2. So I don't know, PJ, if we could do that math here.
Right. But you haven't been out of prison yet. You're still
not out of prison yet.
Yeah.
You're getting other cases heard by appeals courts, but eventually you get out, right? And you're able to get out, you said, like a year early.
Yeah, so I went to the halfway house in October of 2008. And I'm eventually released from custody April of 2009. So just a few months short of 11 years. I had earned some good time while in federal prison, so I didn't have to serve the whole 12 years, 3 months.
Where you get like an extra few weeks for getting cases heard by the Supreme Court.
No, you get an extra few weeks for sitting in your cell reading a novel. That's the thing. No matter what I did, it never led to anything I wouldn't have gotten had I just sat in the day room and played cards all day. But yeah, I get released October 2008. You guys remember what the economy was like around that time?
It was all, you know, if you told people that you robbed banks, though, a couple of people would probably be like, well, yeah, they deserve it. Right. Like at that time period. But I don't think, just to put in context of that time period, like you went in 98, right?
Yep.
So, I mean, that's the back end of Clinton, all of Bush, and the beginning of Obama. That's how long you were gone or locked away.
And when I'm released in October of 2008, get this, never been on the internet. Never seen an iPhone, an iPad, an iPod. One of the things that almost tripped me up with getting my job at Cockle Printing was I told them I had a reference letter from Seth Waxman, and they said, well, email us a PDF of the reference letter. I didn't know what a PDF was. No one else in the halfway house did either. So I ended up going to that interview and pulling this rumpled reference letter from Seth Waxman out my back pocket because I didn't know what a PDF was or how to email it to anyone. And, late 2008, no one's finding work, let alone the guy that
Right.
just got out of federal prison. And so, I can't tell you how many job interviews I went to. My now wife drove me around to probably 30 or 40. There's one I always love to tell the story about because I will remember it for the rest of my life. Interviewing to be a used car salesman. And the owner looks at my resume and says, "You got like a 10-year resume gap here." I no sooner get the word prison out of my mouth, and he's like, "Let's take a walk." So we walk through the showroom. We walk past the people looking at the cars. We get just outside the door, and he says, "Mr. Hopwood, please don't ever come back here again."
Oh my God.
And it's at this point that I realize, like, the ethical bar for used car dealers is not high.
Yeah.
I might not find a job anywhere.
Oh,
wow.
So that's one side of it. You end up getting this job. And I also imagine that there's people now who are out, who are just great. You've helped get out through your legal expertise that you've self-taught. Do you have any experiences of like folks who were on the other side before you, who like came in and supported you when you got out?
Yeah, well, I think one was my now wife. We grew up in the same hometown together, knew each other, but not well. My mom worked for her dad, and when Annie got done with college, she worked for her dad, became friends with my mom. And I remember my mom saying, "Hey, do you remember Anne Marie Metzner?" And I said, "Of course, she was the prettiest girl in town." My mom's like, "Oh, Anne says she's going to send you a letter." And I was like, "Oh, Mom, that's nice. But I'm sure Anne Marie has more important things than sending some dude in prison who's got 8 more years to do a letter." But for whatever reason, she did. And we became close through letters and phone calls and visits. But when I got out, I kind of knew she was it for me. And she drove me around to all these job interviews and just supported me when, I had some family that would too. But outside of that, after 10 years, most of my friends had gone by the wayside and there was nobody else. And it's one of the reasons why people that serve long terms of imprisonment have such a hard time getting out. Community is so important for reentry. We're social creatures. Everybody wants to get out and feel like they are supported and loved by a particular community. And if you get out and you're living on the knife's edge about making rent every month and something happens with your job and you have no family or friends to turn to, well, that's usually when people are put to the choice of homelessness or crime. And listen, if most Americans were put to the choice of homelessness or crime, they'd rationally choose crime because no one chooses to be homeless. It's why we have to make sure that people don't get to that point. And so for me, I had, resources and people that others did not. And that certainly played a role in me having success post-prison.
And so you get this job. Can you just briefly describe what this first job you get is out of prison?
Yeah, so Cockle Legal Briefs is one of 5 Supreme Court brief printers. They consult with lawyers all over the country and help lawyers file briefs to the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, it's incredibly strange that this particular company that does all of their work in the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington, D.C. is somehow located in downtown Omaha. That was very strange. It was actually my 3rd job out of prison. My first job was making telemarketing calls to people in Oregon around dinner time. And I would call and people would yell and cuss and scream at me. And because I had been in prison for nearly 11 years, you know what I did? I yelled and cussed and screamed back. That job lasted 1 day. 1 day. Remember the no de-escalation piece? Yeah. Let's just say I was not the greatest at customer service.
Pavlov's dog, right? They launched right in and you just... Oh my God.
And I just met him there and exceeded it. And so my second job was washing cars outside at a used car dealership in Council Bluffs, Iowa. But it's October. I knew November in Nebraska it's going to freeze and I'm going to be out of a job. And luckily I found this job with Cockle. And for whatever reason, they took a chance on me when few people would. And that was my big break, getting that job.
And that was what really led you to think, hey, I want to go to law school. So what was that process like? You decide you want to go to law school. Did you know that you'd be able to get in? Like how did you think through that period?
I wanted to work as a paralegal for a law firm. I couldn't dream big enough to imagine going to law school. And there was no real model for that for someone with multiple felonies. So I thought that's what I was going to do. Seth Waxman and my wife encouraged me to apply to law school. I didn't think it would happen. I applied to 50 law schools. And to this day, I think in the history of the hundreds of thousands of people that applied to law school, I don't know of anyone that could say, I had 2 cases granted by the Supreme Court of the United States before they applied to law school. But none of that mattered, man. 48 of the 50 law schools looked at my application and were like, nope.
Wow.
Nope. Creighton said yes. Creighton was located in Omaha, Nebraska. I knew people on the faculty. That's probably why they said yes. And the other one was the University of Washington. And there was a professor that I worked with through Cockle who, when he found out about my story, called me and said, Shon, this is a great story. You're going to come to the University of Washington. And I remember telling him, well, Eric, I'll apply there, but I'm going to apply some other places. And he said, well, you can apply wherever you want, but I think you're going to come to school here. And it turned out that was the case. And he became a mentor and a good friend to me while I was in law school. And I was fortunate enough to get a $170,000 full ride scholarship to go to law school.
Wow.
And, I was just happy to be there.
And you started a family at this point too now, right?
Yeah. Well, that was the, part of the problem was I had a 20-month-old son and another baby on the way when we moved to Seattle. And it's not that we were just poor. I owed $175,000 in restitution for the banks that I had robbed. So we were in the hole $175,000. And if you know anything about law school, it's incredibly expensive. So we didn't know how we were going to make it work. And I had applied for this Gates Public Service Scholarship. Bill Gates Sr. is alumni of my law school, not junior, senior, and had this scholarship that pays for everything. In return for 5 years after law school, you work in public interest law, which is what I had planned to do anyway. And so, it worked out well.
Wow.
I won't tell Mr. Gates that you're using a Mac right now.
That's right. A lot of my classmates use Macs. It always made me wonder because Microsoft has such a huge presence on the University of Washington campus. I mean, half the buildings are named Gates something.
So you're there. How did you experience that? You're a 30-something with a family. You've been in prison for 10 years. And I know a lot of my friends who ended up going to law school right out of undergrad, and they have very minimal real life experience. And you have those students now as a professor. What was that experience like, having gone through the criminal justice system and now being with a bunch of kids who've never had that life experience?
Well, it was it's always strange when you're in a place where everyone knows all about your story and you know nothing about them. And it was weird because everybody knew, everybody knew my background and, my classmates, I enjoyed a lot. And it was fun to go to law school with them. But, there were times where, I'll give you an example, where I'm at a party, law school party, bunch of law school students there. I'm married and have 2 kids. So when I went to these parties, I would show up for an hour, eat a few chips, and then leave. I go to use the bathroom at one of these parties. And when I walk in, one of my classmates is doing blow off the sink.
Oh my God.
And my first thought was, and he's not going to have any problem getting his law license and getting through the bar, and I'm going to have to go in and beg and plead and ask them to overlook my background for something I did 20 years ago.
Yeah. Wow.
In order to get into the lawyer club. And you know, that those sorts of things made me resentful. But for the most part, you know, I was so happy to be in law school in my 30s. The other students would sweat and stress over law school. I did a little bit, but you know, studying law and reading textbooks is not the same level of stress as people chasing you with a toothbrush sharpened into a knife. And so perspective really helps. And you know, my perspective was there's nothing in law school that is going to be any more difficult than the things I had already overcome.
Did it feel redundant? I mean, you had gotten 2 cases heard by the Supreme Court. Like, now you're starting from square one. Did you like feel like Michael Jordan having to go try out for the high school basketball team? Like, what was that like?
There was a little bit of that. You know, I had already learned how to be a lawyer. There were certainly things I learned in law school that I hadn't learned on my own, and it brought value. But I can't say, and this is nothing against my law school or the faculty or the way they taught class, I can't say that had I not gone to law school, I wouldn't be able to do stuff at the same level I do today. Because most of the work that law school trains you to think like a lawyer, I had already, you know, I had litigated over 100 cases by the time I walked in the law school doors. And so, you know, this stuff was a lot easier for me than it was for other people.
Wow. I just couldn't imagine being like your teachers. Just must have been like, oh man, I never did that. You know, they're going to try to explain to you, and then, but that's just
my professors were very easy to deal with and gave me a lot of latitude. And I tell you, I worked all the way through law school. So I was still ghostwriting legal briefs for law firms all the way through law school. I also don't learn very well through lectures. I have a hard time keeping my attention. I learned through using the materials. And a lot of times I would just sit in the back and be working on a brief in the middle of law school class. And occasionally, I bet my classmates probably thought I was the dumbest law school student ever, because occasionally I would not be paying attention, and then the professor would ask me a question, which I didn't know the answer to, and I'd just fumble my way through it. But it was because I was working on some other case in the back row.
You were filing, you're like filing a writ for the Supreme Court.
So it was a weird law school experience. I tell my students now, don't do what I did. You should do the reading and study. Just because I didn't doesn't mean you should. But ultimately, you know, it was a wonderful experience to be in that sort of welcoming academic environment versus prison.
Yeah, it sounds that way. So I'm cognizant of time, and I want to be able to push this ahead because you've done so much incredible work since graduating law school. It's a big part of your story. So you graduate law school, you get this, basically the second most prestigious clerkship after the Supreme Court. I'm still wondering why the Supreme Court didn't take you, but that could be another conversation. You finish that clerkship and you end up, you know, we fast forward ahead a few years, you end up becoming a law professor at Georgetown University. A
law school that would not admit me, by the way. I couldn't get admitted as a student there.
Wow.
I'm having the same experience right now with Georgetown, where they've hired me to do consulting work, but they just flat out rejected my college application, but now they want me on their team. So we share that. We share that commonality. You're now, you know, you're a humble guy, but you're a real foremost leader in kind of the criminal justice reform efforts over the last 3 years. And you've had this purview where you've been inside the system, you've seen what the system has done to people, and how you have been one of the lucky ones, and you've made an impact. What are you like? Which accomplishment are you most proud of to date?
I don't know. I don't really think about those things. Honestly, I don't think about the things I've done. I think about the things I'm now doing. I've got people's cases I'm litigating in federal courts across the country. I still do policy work for members of Congress informally and the White House. I'm monitoring what's going on in the Federal Bureau of Prisons during the COVID-19 pandemic and seeing how the prison's responding horribly, by the way. Yeah. I'm just focused on the next thing I can do to help people and to how to fix the system. I'm not very reflective about the things that got me here because I just don't think about those, in part because I'm in a job now where, if I have my way, I will never need a resume ever again for the rest of my life. And it allows me to just focus on the work I'm doing and not really focus so much on career advancement.
What I find interesting is that you were in prison for 11 years and now just about out for 11.
Yes.
So you're gone for 11 years, warehoused, and what you've packed into this 11 years, and so when you answer like that, I'm like, yeah, you're that guy. You're like, I'm not looking. Do you think, having that time taken away from you, is that part of the fuel that just has you going?
Yes. Well, and some of it's not always intentional, I proposed to my wife 3 weeks after being out of federal custody. My wife had an eating disorder, anorexia, for a bunch of years, to the point where doctors had told her it's going to be very difficult for you to have children. So it came as a big surprise a week after I proposed, only a month after I'd been out of prison, that I find out, well, you're going to be a dad. And boy, that scared me almost as much as going to prison. Wow. I'm $175,000 in the hole, and now I've got a wife and a child on the way. And so, in 11 years, married, 2 kids, finished a bachelor's degree, finished a law degree, clerked for a federal judge, was a teaching fellow for 2 years at Georgetown, and have been a full-time professor for several years, and worked on criminal justice reform. And I tell you, it almost feels like somebody else did that time, and that was another life, and that this is a new life. And, it feels strange.
When I've been telling people your story, like who you're interviewing this week, right? And I'll break it down without anything. I'm like, oh man, this guy's a professor at Harvard, and, he went to prison for robbing banks. Georgetown, sorry. Professor at Georgetown, and he went to prison for robbing banks. And they're like, whoa, that's so cool. That's amazing. No one goes, well, he shouldn't be doing that. When I break it down to you as an individual, but then I think there's a pushback when it gets bigger numbers. So is there a way to kind of make each one, to make, just get through to people's heads? It's like each number is a person in a story.
That's right.
Is there a way to translate?
Yeah. We have to humanize the people that are in prison. And I think part of your reaction, it's part of a strange reaction I get a lot, which is, for whatever reason, maybe because of Hollywood, the media, what have you, bank robbery is something that people can very easily get over. I don't know why that's the case. Listen, when I was in the halfway house, I had to go to a bank to open a bank account. And the banker was like, the credit agency said, you haven't banked for 10 years, and they say you're deceased. And I said, well, that's not true. It's just because I've been in federal prison for 10 years. So then he's typing and typing. He keeps looking over at me. And I said, you can ask me, man. And he's like, so what did you do? And it's then that I realized, you dummy. Why did you start this conversation? Because the last thing a former bank robber wants to say is the word robber in a bank. But I said, I robbed some banks, but no one got hurt. And you know what he said? Oh, cool. And went back to typing.
Oh my God.
And I think people, for whatever reason, because it's been glamorized, can get over bank robbery in a way that they can't some other crimes. And I think, that's a small part of why I've been able to overcome some of the hurdles I have.
Just one thing, and this is just coming to me as we're talking. It's like you are, and I think this is something like PJ and I also have, like we don't tend to give ourselves enough credit for what we do. And like it's very clear that you have to have been working incredibly hard at every single stage. You're talking about like, you're just like, yeah, so I applied to 50 law schools. Like the sheer volume of that's a lot of work to submit 50 law school up. And you're just like, that's a throwaway line. You've like, yeah, I'm just submitting some briefs on the side. Like it seems that your motor, like your just motor now is on another level. Like how do you keep yourself going just from a pure drive perspective?
Yeah, I work a lot. I always say I've got 3 full-time jobs. One, I'm a professor at Georgetown. I teach law school students. I'm in contact with law school students every week, writing letters of recommendation, even during the summer. And then the other job is I still litigate cases in federal courts. And that's not something that's easy to shut off because courts don't care about vacations and they don't, you're on their timetable. And then the other third of my time is spent doing criminal justice reform. But to go back to what you said, I have worked a lot. I read 4,000 judicial opinions for fun in prison. I spend a lot of time thinking and working at the law, but I tell you that without people like Seth Waxman and my wife and a handful of others, none of that shit would have mattered.
Yeah.
Because nobody would have gave me a second chance. It was only because people gave me grace through the form of supporting me in second chances that I was able to do it. And I am very cognizant of that. It also didn't hurt that, listen, I'm a white guy that doesn't look like what people in their mind think of people in prison.
Yeah.
And certainly, had I looked different, things would have been more difficult for me. It's not to say I couldn't have overcome it all, but I might not, have gotten as high as I did because of how I looked and because of how people perceive me. So, I like to tell people I am not a pick yourself up by the bootstraps story. That I had to put in the work, and without the hard work, the second chances from other people wouldn't have mattered either. But without the second chances from other people, my story would look very different.
And given that, do you ever feel any pressure?
All the time. All the time. I feel like I am the flag bearer for everyone that's ever caught a misdemeanor, let alone gone to prison. And I get emails from people all over the world who did something bad in their past. Sometimes it's not even a crime. And now are trying to turn it around and want to apply to school. Anybody that's ever gotten in trouble with the law and applying to school ends up in my inbox. And so I do feel the need to kind of represent former prisoners and to try and, it would be very easy for me to just be a law professor and that's it. I'd have a pretty cushy life. But I would also feel incredibly guilty about not doing more to improve the system for people that I left behind.
And how do you cope with that? How do you keep going?
I don't know. I mean, I work with a lot of formerly incarcerated people, and I can tell you the one thing across the board I see is trauma. I work with some veterans who've told me that the trauma of prison is no different than the trauma of wartime. Because it's very much the same adrenal gland pumping out because you're constantly in fear the entire time you're in prison. And, I always encourage everyone to go get treatment for the trauma. But of course, what have I done? Not a damn thing to try and deal with my own trauma and the own shit that is left over from prison. And it has negatively impacted my relationships with my wife and kids. And it's only recently that I've begun to realize that I need to get some help for myself and take some active steps to deal with some of the stuff I saw and experienced in prison.
And that's, I mean, just hearing that, that's even a privilege that you can think about that now. Like you're now at this point 11 years later where you have the professional stature, the ability just to have space to think about that. I think of how fortunate you are. I mean, yeah, obviously for the support, but your hard work, and how most other people don't even have the space. Like I always say, like
I
this
know.
whole self-care thing is like self-care is a privilege.
It is.
And that just hits hard. It's like you are at such a position now is when you're able to think about that.
I don't think I thought about it a lot with myself, because up until, 2 years ago, my entire life, I had lived paycheck to paycheck. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, that is always at the forefront of your mind, is how are we going to make enough money to make it to the next month and the next month? And there's not time for self-reflection when you're in that state. And it was only once I got out of that and the stress of that. And let me tell you, as far as stress goes, the stress of making sure there's food on the table and next month's rent is by far the highest to me. Once I was able to get past that, that's when I was able to realize, hey, listen, there's some things that are left over from prison that you really need to get a handle on. And I saw formerly incarcerated leaders who had an enormous success and didn't deal with the trauma, and then it would come back to bite them, and they'd have a huge fall from grace and do it publicly. And I realized, like, listen, if I go out and get a DUI and hit somebody and hurt them, it's going to be on the front page of papers. It's going to be public and it's going to be horrific. And, I got to make sure that I just don't ever get to that point.
And it's you say that hits home. So I'm part of this fellowship program called the Echoing Green Fellowship. And there's a lot of people who've come out of the criminal justice system who are now doing organizations to support those who are in the criminal justice system. And what's so challenging for me, and you see this, is the way in which they're put on a pedestal, the way in which they have to become a symbol for a movement. And I've seen a lot of them burn out. Like I've seen a lot of them leave, have issues with issues with drug and alcohol again, die. And it speaks to the challenge of the system, where even when we choose to put the people on pedestal and we put them on stage for the fundraisers and our foundations, use them to raise money, they're one step away from returning. It's really challenging.
Yeah. And it's just, when you have prior convictions, you always realize you're never going to get the benefit of the doubt. I mean, I think that way all the time. Just one example, I don't meet with law school students in my office without the door open. Male, female, I don't meet with students in weird times where other people aren't around. And it's because, I don't want anyone to say that I've ever done anything inappropriate. And I know that if somebody did say that, I would not get the benefit of the doubt. So I have to order my life in a way to make sure that I try and eliminate as much risk as possible.
Man, that's
it's a shitty way to live life.
Well, no, but I think a lot of people have to do that, because there's this part of the world now that we used to be able to learn from mistakes, and now people will define you by them if they can use it against you. And that's like, in this world now, we have to kind of take a few steps ahead. And then if they put you on a pedestal, they almost enjoy more taking you down. I know. And I'm very happy to hear that you've come to that point where, I mean, all this nose to the ground, making all these amazing things happen for yourself. And your story represents so much, but the fact that like, okay, there's time I have to really take care of myself it's really really cool to hear.
Yeah, well, I've realized that, most of my clients are at their worst and lowest parts of life. I represent mostly people who have been charged with federal crimes, or I represent people who, have experienced excessive force and are maybe suing a police officer for a civil rights claim. And all of those people are at their lowest. And when you work with people that are at their lowest and you're empathetic towards them, it does, you bring that stuff home with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to kind of escape it. And I tell my students all the time, I preach to them about self-care, and I say, do as I say, not as I do.
Mm-hmm.
But, I'll figure it out. And the fact that I'm aware of it gives me a leg up on being able to make the changes so that I can be in this game long term.
Yeah. And it goes back to that purpose. You want to, like, your work isn't done. Like I asked
That's
you
right.
what your favorite accomplishment is. You're like, I don't think about that. You have your eyes forward.
I was just thinking about my favorite accomplishment, and I thought about one.
Go for it.
I represented a man named Matthew Charles. You may have seen him in the news. He's been in the news a lot the last couple of years. So he had a 35-year sentence for selling crack cocaine.
Mm.
Horrible criminal history. Had done some violent crimes before that. The judge rightfully thought, I got to send this guy away for a long time because he's dangerous.
Mm.
What the judge could not anticipate was that Matthew would go to prison, turn his life around.
Mm.
He does 21 straight years in the Federal Bureau of Prisons without even a small incident report.
Mm.
People hold me up as the model of rehabilitation. I got 3 incident reports in 11 years, and that's only because I got caught 3 times. Matthew goes 21 years without. He applies for resentencing. The judge grants it and lets him out of prison.
Mm.
He goes home to Nashville and does everything we want of someone coming out of prison. He gets a job, gets a place to live, makes community in his Nashville church, and get this, can't make this up. Every Saturday morning, he takes time to go volunteer at a soup kitchen for the homeless called The Little Pantry That Could, and he hands out meals to homeless people. The Department of Justice thinks that he should not have been released. They appeal his sentence. They win in the Court of Appeals. The judge has to bring him back in after 2 years of being out.
Oh my God.
And resentence him to 9 more years in federal prison. Matthew goes back into prison.
Mm-hmm.
It's at that point that I start representing him. I was working on clemency, trying to get the president to grant him a pardon. Ultimately, that didn't happen, but the First Step Act was passed instead. I worked on that bill for a year.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the Oval Office the day the president signed the bill. Matthew Charles was the first person released under the First Step Act.
Mm-hmm.
A week after he's released, and I had Lester Holt and the NBC camera crew all at the jail, so they got footage of when he was released. NBC did a big piece on him. A week or 2 later, he is sitting on my couch hanging out with my kids. And a couple days after that, he is the guest of the President of the United States at the State of the Union address. And President Trump acknowledges him publicly and says, "Welcome home, Matthew." That was pretty damn cool.
Wow.
Pretty damn cool.
I think that is a good segue to our final question, which is, how do you want to be remembered?
I'll tell you, I've been thinking more and more about, I want to be remembered as a good husband and a good dad. And I always have work to do in that space. I want to spend more time thinking about that and doing better in that arena. I would love to see the federal criminal justice system. I'd just love to see us send a lot fewer people to prison. I think there are ways of holding people accountable without sending them to prison and crippling them for life. I'd like to someday, hopefully, maybe get a pardon myself and have my slate wiped away clean. Even as a white male law professor at one of the most prestigious law schools in the country, my felony conviction still impacts my life. I can't go teach my kids Little League because I have this prior conviction. And, I hope that at some point people will realize that the bad things I did are so grossly outweighed by the good things that's what I hope they remember me by as. Not something I did when I was 21, but everything that happened after that.
That's awesome. Shon Hopwood, thank you for joining In Stitches.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Man, that was just, an incredible story, and also a story that's still being written. I think back to the beginning of that episode when he talks about, I want to be more than a story. Yeah, yes, I have committed a violent crime, but I am not a violent criminal, right? Being able to be seen and heard for all the good you've done rather than the one bad thing that you've done. That's what stuck with me most as you just kind of experience that entire conversation.
I'm walking away with how much wasted potential there probably is in the prison system. He painted this picture and of his experience and how most the guys were fine guys. So it's just a system that doesn't nurture anything in that fashion. And he luckily found a way to have it, to find some purpose. There's also that duality of once you lost purpose and once you got purpose, when you do get it, and how it could be a driving force for good. So I found that to be, it just makes me like question so much about the whole entire process, because I didn't know anything about it. And now I'm like looking at it completely different.
Well, I think that's the hope from these episodes. We can learn a thing or two ourselves through these conversations.
I do know we're going to learn something when you go, I know we're deep in Sam land. We're deep in Sam land.
That is my signal to the audience that something insightful was just said. All right. Well, Peter, that's another episode of In Stitches. And I know we couldn't have done this alone.
No, we got a lot of people to thank. Lots of support we got.
At least one person, and that's our executive producer, Dave Bobro, who really helps us from start to finish in getting these episodes ready and clean, and the strong place that you hear them right now.
Thank you so much, Dave. And thank you for listening. Our listeners, we have listeners, Sam. They're awesome. Thank you guys who've left reviews and give us all those, we got 5 stars. I think we're up to 10, Sam. 5-star rating is on Apple. We got lots of retweets, so please visit us at In Stitches Podcast, on all the social media platforms. We got a lot of really cool stuff coming up.
This has been In Stitches.